Hello, Roy.RealEstate with Core Banker Legacy in San Angelo. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about flood insurance. Flood insurance is kind of a weird thing, and with our flooding in San Angelo, some of the other places in Texas recently, things kind of come up. So a little bit of history. Years ago, flooding was covered in your basic insurance policy, and after some major widespread disasters, the insurance company said, we can't do this. And so what happened is the government stepped in and created the National Flood Insurance Program. Like most government programs, it's not necessarily the most well-run thing in the world and doesn't always work like it's supposed to. But the basics of it is that FEMA lays out these floodplains, a 100-year floodplain, and there's some sub and levels above that and below that, but the 100-year one is the big one that affects people. So when someone is buying a home and they're in that 100-year floodplain, they are generally forced by their lender, assuming they got a loan on the property, to buy flood insurance. And that will be forced on them the whole term of that loan. But this makes for an odd situation because that means that flooding is not covered by your basic insurance policy. So if you're not in a flood zone, or if you don't have a lender and you weren't forced to buy that insurance, you could have easily bought a home and not have flood insurance on it. This would be like if your car insurance, if you had one insurance policy for theft and a second insurance policy for an accident and a third insurance policy for if you ran into a deer. And so you'd have to manage multiple policies, and so it gets difficult. And so it's one of the things, these areas that flooded in San Angelo, for the most part, were not in flood zones. Most of these houses that had flooding were not in flood zones, because it's based on that 100-year floodplain. Well, what happened was in a small area of town, we had a 300 or 400 or 500-year flood. And a lot of these neighborhoods and stuff, they're almost like a bathtub. The water runs into them, but there's no plug, there's no way to get the water out. So just something to be aware of as you're looking at houses, even think about those things. Obviously, these houses that flooded now, that's going to be reported, and you're going to be able to find out that those houses flooded, and so steps will have to be taken to try to mitigate that risk, although it may not happen for another 200, 300 years. Who knows? It could happen again in 6 months. That's the problem with it, is you never know. So just something to be aware of how the flood insurance program works. And anyone can go buy flood insurance whether they're in the floodplain or not. It's actually much less expensive if you're not in the floodplain, but most people don't because the lender doesn't require it. It's just an extra expense that you don't need until you need, like all insurance. So just a complicated situation, and just thinking of how it affects some homeowners when you're buying a house, to think about these things, to look at where that house is. And most of the houses affected were older houses that weren't built even thinking about this, but that's not totally true. There were some fairly new houses that were built, and the situation was unique, and just stuff dumped to a place and just couldn't get out fast enough. So flood insurance is a big thing. It's difficult to understand, so just be aware of some of these things. So thanks. If you got any questions, give me a call.